Welcome to the Tech Talks by Microsoft EMEA. My name is Manfred Helber. I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in the category Cloud and Data Center. And today we will talk about Windows Server 2012 end of support and how to migrate to Azure Stack HCI. You're watching this live stream via YouTube on the YouTube channel of Sven Langenfeld or on my YouTube channel, and you can use the chat functionality to ask your questions about Windows Server 2012 end of support, Azure Stack HCI, migration, and so on. So feel free to use the chat to ask your questions, to send your comments. I will take them and answer these live here in the show. So before we start with the live demo about how to migrate to Windows Server from Windows Server 2012 to Azure Stack HCI, we will take a few minutes to talk about Azure Stack HCI, what it is, and why it's different to Windows Server, because this is the important thing to understand. In the last Tech Talk, we discussed about how to migrate from Windows Server 2012 to Windows Server 2022. And we have seen how to migrate Hyper-V hosts. We have seen how to migrate file servers. We discussed about how to migrate RDS hosts. And the migration to Azure Stack HCI is different because Azure Stack HCI is part of Azure, and this is important to understand. Sven Langenfeld is also watching the Tech Talk, and he has sent a first comment via the chat or comment functionality on YouTube. He's writing, "Hello, EMEA server community." You can do the same, so feel free to write your comments to the YouTube chat on both YouTube channels or one of the two YouTube channels to send in your comments or to ask your questions about this migration topic today. So important, I mentioned this, is to understand that Azure Stack HCI is part of Azure. And if you want to migrate workloads to Azure, then we have some different tools, we have some different steps for these migrations. Azure Stack HCI has also HCI in the name. So Azure Stack HCI is a hyperconverged infrastructure. The hyperconverged infrastructure uses industry standard servers in combination with Windows based technologies. It's storage spaces direct, it's software defined networking, it's Hyper-V. So we know these technologies from Windows Server, especially in the data center edition, because as you know, the storage spaces direct feature is part of the data center edition since Windows Server 2016. And now since more than 1 year, we have a dedicated HCI operating system for Microsoft. It's the Azure Stack HCI OS. Azure Stack HCI OS can start in a very small implementation with 2 small servers. And starting with these two small servers, we have the full Azure Stack HCI functionality. We have the redundancy, we have the scalability, we have the performance, and we have the Azure integration. So if you are thinking about an entry-level solution to migrate your smaller Windows Server 2012 based environments to an modern server infrastructure, then Azure Stack HCI is the best choice. And if you need more scale, it's important to know that Azure Stack HCI can scale up to 16 nodes with up to 4 petabyte storage in each cluster, and we can have several of these clusters. So we don't have a limitation to one of these clusters. We can run 4 or 10 or hundreds of these clusters. Important is also to understand that Azure Stack HCI runs in our data center. So it runs on our physical hardware. We can select the hardware from different vendors that offer Azure Stack HCI certified solutions. We have a bare metal installation of this operating system, and it runs on your on premises. It runs in the location where you decide to run it. For sure, you can also run it in a hosted environment where you use a server hosting or housing, but it's always an Azure Stack HCI configuration dedicated to one customer. So if a customer wants to run Azure Stack HCI, this customer needs its own Azure Stack HCI solution, It's connected to Azure, but it runs on premises. It's an operating system very similar to Windows Server to the core installation. What you see in the screenshots here is the server core graphical user interface. It's a reduced graphical user interface with limited graphical features, with limited graphical surface that's focused on the hyperconverged functionality and the Azure integration. The Azure integration is in Azure Stack HCI because it behaves like Azure. It's an Azure platform, and Azure Stack HCI is paid as a subscription. So you don't have any upfront costs for Azure Stack HCI. You only connect your Azure Stack HCI solution to Azure, and then you have costs per month per core. It's based on the physical cores. So now when it comes to a migration of workloads, we are thinking about virtual machines typically. Azure Stack HCI is also capable to run containerized workloads. So if you want to modernize your workload, it's also possible to do this in combination with Azure Stack HCI. But I assume the typical migration will be that you migrate virtual machines to Azure Stack HCI. And when you are thinking about virtual machines in Hyper-V, you might think that we can move the virtual machines to Azure Stack HCI because Hyper-V is in Windows Server and Hyper-V is in Azure Stack HCI. And important is to understand that this is not possible because Microsoft does not support any live migration or replica action from Hyper-V directly to Azure Stack HCI. So it doesn't make a difference if you migrate your workload from Windows Server 2012, 2012 R2, 2016, 2019, 2022 to Azure Stack HCI. You always have to do it via an export and import or via a robocopy action. Robocopy, there you can automate this. If you have many virtual machines via export import, you are flexible to do this on a single VM basis and migrate VM after upgrade. Or the first upgrade was from Azure Stack HCI 20H2 to 21H2. And all the clusters that were installed with 20H2 had to install or had to migrate to Azure Stack HCI 21H2 in the last days. But this does not mean that you have to change anything on your workload. Your workload is already VM workload on Azure Stack HCI, and it is already containerized workload on Azure Stack HCI. So your advantage is when you move to Azure Stack HCI that you can keep your virtual machines. You have once the migration. I will demo to you in a few minutes how this works. And then the virtual machines, the containers, stay on Azure Stack HCI. They keep their version you have decided for, and your platform, the Azure Stack HCI platform, will be updated once a year. Usually you have up to 6 months till you install the newer version that Microsoft published. How this migration works, we will see this in the next live demo in a few minutes. Before we migrate the workload to Azure Stack HCI, it's important to understand that we need a license there because Azure Stack HCI itself provides the HCI platform and the Azure integration. We don't have any virtual usage rights on Azure Stack HCI out of the box. There are different ways to receive this this virtual usage rights for Windows Server. But important is to understand, as soon as you move one virtual machine from an Hyper-V host or an Hyper-V cluster to Azure Stack HCI, where you have installed Windows Server in this virtual machine, you need a valid Windows Server license, not for the virtual machine, because the virtual machine cannot have a Windows Server license. Windows Server licensing is always done by the physical host. This means you need to ensure that your physical host has an server licensing option that allows you to run virtual Windows Server machines on this Azure Stack HCI clusters. And this can be done via the Windows Server subscription via Azure. This is relatively new, this option. So you can decide for also subscribing for the Windows Server license via Azure. But you can also bring your own license. Maybe you have already existing licenses, or maybe you decide not to have a subscription for Windows Server, but to buy a perpetual license where you have the license for the next 3, 5, or 10 years, and where you don't have monthly costs based on the physical cores, because the Windows Server subscription on the left-hand side is based on the physical cores per month. The bring your own license costs depend on the licensing model you decide for. For activating your virtual machines, you can decide between automatic virtual machine activation. This is an Hyper-V feature, or in the volume license, the key management service. The interesting thing at the bring your own license option is that you can also use the cost optimized OEM licenses, so the direct OEM or the reseller option kit that is provided by your preferred hardware vendor. And this is also possible in combination with Azure Stack HCI. But what is not possible to run Windows Server workload on Azure Stack HCI without any additional Windows Server licenses. It would be possible to run Azure Stack HCI only if you only have Linux workloads, but we are talking about migrating Windows Server VMs to Azure Stack HCI. And if we have some of these VMs, we can use Azure Stack HCI in combination with Windows Server standard stacking licenses. Important, the Windows Server license is not inside the VM, it's always at the host. So we have to license all the hosts for Windows Server standard, once to receive 2 virtual usage rights, twice to receive 4 virtual usage rights, and so on. And typically, we will find configurations where we have Azure Stack HCI in combination with Windows Server Data Center, because there we have unlimited virtual usage rights. Okay, we talked about the Azure Stack HCI basics, the requirements, the scalability. We talked about the licensing topic. If there are questions, feel free to use the chat functionality. And now we want to talk about how to migrate from Hyper-V to Azure Stack HCI, your existing workload. The important thing is to understand on the left-hand side, we have Windows Server. On the right-hand side, Azure Stack HCI. This means we have once Windows, and the target is Azure. The name for this Azure target is Azure Stack HCI. And yes, it's on premises, but it is Azure from the platform perspective. And this means, important note, Hyper-V Live migration and Hyper-V Replica are not available for the migration. But we have other powerful tools. We could use, for example, Azure Migrate in the future. This is actually in preview. This is great if you have a huge environment. If you have a smaller environment and if you want to understand what happens when you migrate, then a very easy way for the migration is to use the export and import. Let's go to an Hyper-V host. Here I have an Hyper-V host. In my demo environment, in my demo lab, this is a virtual machine. And in this Hyper-V host, for sure, I have functionalities like live migration with the move option, or the enable replication, but this is only available for or in combination with a Hyper. In combination with Azure Stack HCI, we can only use the export functionality. So this is an important thing to understand to be successful. So this is for Hyper-V and for Azure Stack HCI targets. So the move option is only available for other Hyper-V targets. This can be other versions, but only for Hyper-V. And the replication option is also only available for other Hyper-V targets. If you are on Azure Stack HCI, if you migrated your complete workload to Azure Stack HCI, then for sure you can move between Azure Stack HCI clusters. So you can move a virtual machine from one Azure Stack HCI cluster to another Azure Stack HCI cluster. You can use these technologies here also in Azure Stack HCI, but not cross-platform between Hyper-V and Azure Stack HCI. And yes, I explained this. Also, Azure Stack HCI has Hyper-V integrated, but Hyper-V is a little bit different in the specific Azure platform implementation. Okay, so let's export a virtual machine. We can export a running virtual machine. This is possible. But if you want to move this machine from this host to the Azure Stack HCI cluster, my recommendation would be to shut down the virtual machine. And I already prepared this, so this virtual machine is already shut down. And I want to export this machine. It's a manual action. I want to export this machine to my virtual machines drive. I have an export folder here, and I want to export this machine to this folder here. It's actually exporting. It's a virtual machine with a Windows Server operating system installed. It could also be Linux. Azure Stack HCI also supports Linux. Hyper-V supports Linux. And so we can also migrate virtual machines with a Linux operating system. Regarding the Linux-based VMs, we don't have to care about any additional licensing requirements because Linux does not require additional Windows Server licenses. Okay, so now I want to import this virtual machine on Azure Stack HCI. It's an easy additional step. I will use the Windows Admin Center to manage the import. This is Windows Admin Center, our web-based management console, and I'm looking on the dashboard of an Azure Stack HCI cluster 30. This is one of my Azure Stack HCI clusters here. Let's wait a few seconds. So this cluster is running, CPU resources are available, memory is available, so we don't have any bottleneck here. So we will have enough resources for this new virtual machine. Also in the volumes, we can see in Azure Stack HCI that we have enough available capacity. So it's only a part of the storage actually used. My volume 1 has enough available capacity to carry this new virtual machine. So first step is to copy the exported data. This is a manual step, or as you have seen on the slide, and I will show you this again after the live demo, you could also use Robocopy to transfer exported content from a virtual machine to the target host. The Robocopy is helpful if you have several machines you want to transfer from one host to the other host. So let's first go to the Hyper-V host. This here is my D102 minus Hyper-V 01 /e$. This is my source machine where I exported this HV01 VM01. And I will copy the bits and bytes of this machine to the new target host. This is what I'm doing here. It's in manual action. And as I mentioned, we could automate this if we have hundreds of these VMs or thousands of these VMs so that we don't have to wait for the copy action and copy it manually, but do it via an automated process here. So the virtual machine is actually copying, or it has been copied. And the next step is via Windows Admin Center, because in Windows Admin Center, I will navigate to the virtual machines. And in the virtual machines list, I can add or import virtual machines. So we'll import a new virtual machine here, import virtual machine. And what I want to import the virtual machine is a virtual machine that's based in a container, in a folder, in storage location, I will select for the drive C, because it's on drive C, it's in the cluster storage, and it's in the volume 01 in the VMs folder, and here in the HV01 VM01. So it depends on your path, on your configuration, what you have to select here. It has to be in the cluster storage in a volume. I prefer this subfolder VMs or VM01 or something like this before I have the VM folder itself. And here it's important to have the right storage location, because if you put it directly on drive C without the cluster storage in the volume, then you could configure a high available virtual machine in Azure Stack HCI that is not really high available. Because for sure, if you want to have a high available virtual machine, the storage location has to be reachable from each node in the cluster. And this is here the case with this cluster shared volume. So let's select the virtual machine to import. I have the HV01 VM01. So the import wizard has found an exported virtual machine in this container. Then we have two options here. First one, create a unique ID for the VM. This is not required. The virtual machine HV01 VM01 has behind this name a unique ID. And the unique ID is relevant for Hyper-V. The unique ID of this virtual machine can be only once in this Azure Stack HCI cluster. We could have 10 or 100 times a virtual machine with the name HV01 VM01, because it's only a name. It's for Hyper-V, it's only a description. It's not recommended to do this, but the unique identifier is the ID behind the name. This has to be unique. And if you want to import this virtual machine twice, for example, once for production and once for demoing, you have to create a new unique ID for one of these two VMs. I want to move the virtual machine from its previous Hyper-V host to Azure Stack HCI. And for me, it's important that, for example, my monitoring solution knows, this is the virtual machine 01. Because if I create a new ID, the monitoring solution will say, okay, this is a new machine. This is not the machine 01 I had before. So recommendation is, if you move a machine via export import from one host to the other host, then keep the ID. If you use a virtual machine as a template, for example, that you import several times, then you for sure have to create a new unique ID. Copy the virtual machine to a new location is important if you didn't specify the correct folder here in the VM location. What I did, I copied the virtual machine already to the folder where the virtual machine should be finally located. If this is different in your scenario because you are selecting the virtual machine from a network share or a USB drive you have connected to your server, then you will select the copy the virtual machine to a new location to ensure that the virtual machine will be copied to your cluster storage here. I don't need these two options in my configuration. And I want to import the virtual machine. The import is running. This is a little bit, it's not absolutely clear to every Windows Admin Center user that we have this notification area here where we can see what's the status, but the virtual machine was already successfully imported. And when we now look here at the list, we can see, we have the HV01, VM01, this machine here. Now we can start this virtual machine here. We can reconfigure the virtual machine. Maybe we need some additional resources. Maybe we need some additional options here. And for sure, then we should remove the virtual machine from the previous host. What's important now, if we want to use the Azure Benefits for this virtual machine, and the question is, what's the Azure Benefits? Our advantage of moving this virtual machine to Azure Stack HCI is, for example, that will receive extended security updates. So let's imagine we moved a virtual machine with Windows Server 2012. So inside the virtual machine, the host was 2012, let's imagine. And inside the virtual machine, we had also Windows Server 2012 installed. Then we have still the extended support end date on 10th October next year, but we will receive extended security updates without any additional costs for this virtual machine when we move the virtual machine to Azure Stack HCI for 1 additional year, for the second additional year, and for the third additional year. So we will receive extended security updates till October 2026. Sorry, 2026. This is an advantage of workloads we are running on Azure Stack HCI, that we will receive the extended security updates for Windows Server, for SQL Server. We also receive the extended security updates for Windows Server 2008, 2008 R2, not only till 2023, but we have an additional year for Windows Server 2008 and 2008 R2. So we will receive the extended security updates till 2024 for Windows Server 2008 and 2008 R2. And for sure, we will also receive the extended security updates for 2012, 2012 R2, and so on. For 2016, we will have the announcement in the future about these dates, but typically this will be 3 years here. It's important to receive these extended security updates to enable the Azure benefits. So when I'm selecting the settings here in my Windows Admin Center on the lower left-hand corner, there we have a settings option in the tools list. Then on an Azure Stack HCI based cluster, I have the Azure Stack HCI registration. This is important for me to have the connectivity to Azure for the subscription-based billing. And at the Azure Benefits, there I can configure that my virtual machines, all of them or some of them, should be enabled to receive the additional benefits based on my Azure subscription. So for the cluster, I have the Azure benefits on, so they can be turned off or can be turned on. I already turned them on this cluster. But now if my virtual machine, this one here, this is the machine we migrated. If this virtual machine is a machine that is running, for example, Windows Server 2012 inside the VM, for sure, I want to have the Azure benefits for this VM. So we'll select this machine and turn on the Azure benefits for this specific machine. And from now on, this machine will be enabled to receive the extended security updates based on the Azure Stack HCI subscription. So we don't have any additional costs. We have the costs of the Azure Stack HCI operating system itself based on cores per month. We have the costs for Windows Server licensing based on the traditional way we add Windows Server licenses to our physical hosts, or via the subscription, but the subscription is also per physical host. It's never inside the VM. And the virtual machine, VM01, receives the extended security updates, but we don't have an additional module we have to subscribe for to receive this. This is only a technical configuration here. Okay, so Azure Benefits, great thing when we move our workload to Azure Stack HCI. And this Azure Benefits is not only available for extended security updates. Azure Benefits is also very important when you think about different services, for example, the remote desktop services. Because when we are looking at remote desktop services, we have the situation that Office based on the Microsoft 365 apps is perfectly supported on Windows 11. So we don't have an end date for the support for Office apps based on Microsoft 365 on Windows 11 clients. But we don't have a support for Office apps from Microsoft 365 on Windows Server 2022. This is important to know if you're working with RDS host scenarios, with terminal server scenarios. To explain this situation, Microsoft says if you are running a modern lifecycle application like Office from the Microsoft 365 apps, then you also need a modern operating system platform like Windows 11. If you want to run a long-term servicing operating system like Windows Server, then you should use a long-term services Office subscription, or it's not a subscription, on a long-term services Office app like Office LTSC, long-term servicing channel, from the volume licenses. Now you have the problem. If you want to configure an RDS host, you can do this with Windows Server 2019. And Windows Server 2019 also runs in a virtual machine on Azure Stack HCI. And there we have support for Office apps in Microsoft 365 till October 2025. But if you are thinking in a long-term solution for this situation, you have to focus on Windows 11. So this is the, let's say, dream team you should decide for. And the limitation of this dream team here is that we don't have Windows 11 that we can configure as a terminal server on premises. This was true in the past, but now we have Azure Virtual Desktop. Azure Virtual Desktop is not new. Azure Virtual Desktop is available since years in Azure. And with Azure Virtual Desktop, we have the advantage. We have our traditional remote desktop services technologies like web access, like the diagnostics, the broker. We have the RDS gateway. We have our clients we use to access our Azure Virtual Desktop configuration. And now the great thing about Azure Virtual Desktop is that we can run our desktop target machines based on Windows Server, like a traditional terminal server or RDS host. But in Azure Virtual Desktop, we have an exclusive feature that's called Windows 10 or Windows 11 multi-session. So there we can use a client operating system. It's fully supported, and it's fully supported by the licensing terms we can use, but only in Azure Virtual Desktop. This client OS, Windows 11, with a multi-user scenario where we have, for example, one of these virtual machines, and this acts as a client terminal server for 10 users, 20 users, 50 users, 100 users. It depends on your resources, on your configuration. Now we have the full support for the Office apps from Microsoft 365. And it's available in Azure today, and it's in preview on Azure Stack HCI. And this is the new thing, that we can run our Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI. So in our data center, in our on-premises location, in our environment, with the full support for desktops based on Windows 11 with a multi-session configuration. And this is the only way to bring Windows 11 multi-user or Windows 11 multi-session for an RDS scenario to on-premises. So you are not allowed, from the licensing perspectives, to configure an Hyper-V host, to put a virtual machine on this Hyper-V host, and to use this virtual machine at the same time with several users. In Windows Client, we always have one console session or one remote desktop session. It's an OR configuration. Console or remote. We don't have many remote sessions or several remote sessions. This is different in the Azure Virtual Desktop configuration here. And so, because this is the long-term strategy, my recommendation would be to really get familiar with Azure Virtual Desktop. The way how to configure it is similar in the option to have Azure Virtual Desktop in Azure or Azure Virtual Desktop on premises on Azure Stack HCI. The advantage of Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI is that you are more flexible regarding the resources. My learning with Azure Virtual Desktop was that the performance with Azure Virtual Desktop increases massively with CPUs and memory and GPUs in Azure or on premises. But if you worked already with Azure Workloads, you know CPU, memory, and GPU is an expensive resource in Azure in the public cloud. Storage is very cheap, but CPU, memory, and GPU is expensive. And the advantage on Azure Stack HCI is that you can buy these resources. So the GPU is not part of your subscription in Azure Stack HCI. You buy the GPU, the memory is not part of your subscription. The costs on Azure Stack HCI are related on your physical cores you have. And there, yes, if you have many physical cores, you have more costs per month, but you can optimize your costs in using powerful cores. As you know, there are different different performance categories regarding the CPUs. So you will be able to buy mid-range CPUs with 16 cores. You will be able to buy high-end CPUs with 16 cores, and the difference is the performance per core. You can add GPUs where you don't have any related costs regarding the licensing. You can add more memory to your on-premises hosts. And because Azure Stack HCI is charged per physical core, you don't have any additional costs if you activate hyperthreading. And with hyperthreading, we can also receive additional performance here in our Azure Stack HCI configurations in combination with Azure Virtual Desktop. And another advantage of Azure Virtual Desktop is it's running on your side, on your on-premises. And this means you have an option to use Azure Virtual Desktop in combination with ShortPath, which allows you to have a direct connectivity from your local network to your virtual desktop hosts. So when we look at this graphic here, at this picture here that is provided via docs.microsoft.com, if you are looking for Azure Virtual Desktop in docs.microsoft.com, you will find this graphics here. There you can see in this graphic, sorry, here's my my pencil. So now let's select another color here. So here we can see we have our Active Directory on premises. This is still available. We will also have our Azure Active Directory. So we are using the Azure Active Directory in combination with the Active Directory domain services. It's configured via an Azure Active Directory Connect. So today we need both. We need the local Active Directory domain services for the Azure Stack HCI cluster, for the local authentication, and we need the Azure Active Directory for the architecture of the RD gateway, the broker, the web configuration, and so on. So the client we can see here, this client will connect via port 443 in the default configuration through the public internet to our RD gateway, maybe via the RD web, and it will receive a session via the RD connection broker. But now in a ShortPath configuration, this ShortPath configuration for Azure Virtual Desktop realizes, oh, there's a better way to access the virtual desktop that's provided by Azure Stack HCI. And this short path, this direct connection, is be handled via the local network. So our advantage is we have lower latency, we have higher bandwidth, we have reduced load on our public internet connection, and so we have the best experience for connecting to our virtual desktops. Because nearly always when I'm speaking about migrating workloads to Azure, I am asked about bandwidth requirements. And for sure, if you have a distributed scenario, if you have your employees in your home office or in their home office, and they are connecting to the service, so for example, Azure Virtual Desktop or a virtual machine or a database or whatever, from these distributed locations, then we have the advantage to bring everything to a public data center like the Azure data centers. But when we are thinking in a different way, when we are thinking about maybe we have 100 users in one location, and these 100 users should access a virtualized desktop, for example, via Azure Virtual Desktop, then we have to calculate for the bandwidth for this single location for 100 users. And if we want to use several monitors, what's possible with Azure Virtual Desktop, with full HD or 4K video on each of these monitors, with true deep color, and with audio and full HD video streaming, then we need something like 4 to 5 megabit per second per user. And when you think about hundreds of users, this is a huge amount of bandwidth you need for this external connectivity. And if you bring this to your on-site location via Azure Stack HCI, then you have the advantage that you keep this traffic inside your network. Yes, you have to configure the short path. It's done via a group policy setting, but the advantage is to have this available. And this is my recommendation to keep always in mind when we are thinking about Azure Stack HCI and this natively integration to Azure, because we discussed in this live stream about migrating virtual machines to Azure Stack HCI. I mentioned containers, and we discussed Azure Virtual Desktop. So as a modern alternative to traditional terminal servers or remote desktop services session hosts. But in the future, we will see more Azure services on Azure Stack HCI. And you should always have a look at the opportunity to put this Azure-related service to Azure Stack HCI when you read about new Azure services, because you will see more and more powerful services in Azure. This is what we learned the last years. This is what we learned in the past, that there's a huge roadmap about new features in the Azure data centers. And several of these features will also be available on the Azure Stack HCI platform. And so they will be available for on-premises. It's also interesting, we didn't migrate this, but for SQL servers, SQL Server is fully supported inside a VM on Azure Stack HCI. And with SQL Server, we can take the advantage from Azure-based SQL Server VMs that run on premises. And for SQL Server, I mentioned this, but I want to ensure that you know this again, that also for SQL Server, we will receive the extended security updates inside Azure Stack HCI. So Azure Stack HCI is Azure, and because it's Azure, we have the automated updates. This automatic update mechanism, you can decide when you migrate to a new Azure Stack HCI version, but it's comparable to the easiness you have in a Windows client. When you have a Windows client operating system, you migrate to a new version with Windows 11, typically once a year. So we have once a year a new Windows 11 version This is what Microsoft communicated. And if you know this experience from Windows 10, where we had 2 versions each year, then you know this migration was very uncomplicated. In an Azure Stack HCI cluster, we have the advantage that we are using cluster-aware updating, so the workload keeps up and running, so the workload keeps online while you are migrating your cluster, because when we are migrating, let's have a look at this in the Windows Admin Center. Then first, the first node will be updated, then the second node, and then the third node. I'll take my Windows Admin Center to show this to you. Here we have the updates for this cluster, and the updating of the cluster is done online automatically. For sure, each node has to be restarted, but the workflow is handled automatically by the cluster aware updating we have here. So we have the full advantages of having subscription-based technology and as a service-based technology with Azure Stack HCI, with regular updates, security updates once a month, feature updates once a year, and we have the advantage that we don't have to reconfigure our workload, because the virtual machines will not be changed. The virtual machines, they keep up and running. They are migrated via live migration to the remaining nodes in this cluster. When the cluster aware updating is patching the first node, then the second node, then the third node, and so on. This year is a 3-node cluster. This is the reason why I'm talking about 3 nodes. And when I will install these updates here, I have a cumulative update for the .NET Framework. I have a security intelligence update for Windows Defender, and I have a cumulative update for the Windows Server operating system for April for each of the nodes. When I'm installing these updates, the cluster-aware updating mechanism will ensure that my virtual machine workload keeps up and running, so that I will not have a downtime for any of this workload here of my virtual machines here. Okay, so great features in the Azure Stack HCI operating system. If you never worked with the Azure Stack HCI operating system, the recommendation is to choose an certified hardware for the Azure Stack HCI operating system. And if you want to get more familiar with Azure Stack HCI, my recommendation is to also have a look at the next tech talks we have, because in the next tech talks, we will focus on Azure Stack HCI. On May the 16th, what is Azure Stack HCI? So in detail, what is this operating system? What is behind it? Then in May 23rd, how to deploy Azure Stack HCI, including a live demo, how to install this Azure Stack HCI operating system. And on May the 30th, how to manage Azure Stack HCI via Windows Admin Center. So I used Windows Admin Center to demo you how to use this hybrid benefits, how to use the migration. Here we will have a detailed session where I will give you deep insights and deep information about how to manage and how to deploy Azure Stack HCI with Windows Admin Center. And on May the 12th at 10:30 a.m., so these sessions are at 12 p.m. Central Eastern Time, and on May 12th we have a Q&A. So you didn't have any individual questions till now. In our 2 previous Tech Talk calls, there were some questions from the audience. If you have questions about the session today, or maybe about the future questions, then feel free to put your questions inside the chat on YouTube. Yes, you need an account, because without account, it's not possible to ask questions there in the chat, but it's an easy 2-click step action to create this account, to be able to log into YouTube and then provide your questions. You can use some additional minutes to write your individual questions. if you don't have any individual questions, I recommend you to already put these dates into your calendar. So I'm looking forward to see you there, to have you there in these 3 additional sessions about Azure Stack HCI, and to give you already an impression about what we are doing in June. In June, we have planned 3 sessions about Windows Server 2022. We are talking about the benefits and licensing of Windows Server 2022 on 13th of June. On 20th of June, we are talking about deployment, management, and monitoring of Windows Server 2022. There we will also see the Windows Admin Center again, because the Windows Admin Center console you have seen in my live demo is a very, very important tool, not only for Azure Stack HCI management, but also for Windows Server management. And we will see Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI, including a demo. We discussed, or I talked about Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Stack HCI to you regarding the migration scenario. In June, I will show you how to configure this and how to bring this to a running configuration. And also in June, we have a Q&A session. If you never attended this Q&A session, this is 1 hour for your questions, where you can ask your questions in the chat. If you don't have any individual questions, I will also always provide some prepared content to have an interesting 1 hour live stream for you. And a question I receive typically about this support of Office compatibility is the question, Manfred, do you think Microsoft will add the support to Windows Server 2022 for the Office 365 apps? And my answer is always, no, I don't think so. And my personal opinion is that this wouldn't be a good decision to have the support here, because as I mentioned, Windows Server 2022 is long-term servicing channel. So our advantage is that we have 10 years support, 10 years support for the specific OS without any changes. The Office 365 apps or Microsoft 365 apps are modern lifecycle channel. This means with the Microsoft 365 apps, a new version each month. This means if we would have a support for this modern lifecycle app on a long-term servicing channel OS, Microsoft had to support 120 different versions once each month. And so this means 12 a year, and 10 years support means 120 different Office versions. I think you can imagine this doesn't make sense. And now the question is, why do we have support for Office 365 apps on Windows Server 2019? This is not a new support agreement or communication. This support for Windows Server 2019 was provided when Windows Server 2019 started in the market, not immediately, because Microsoft wanted to start with this not supported scenario on Windows Server already with Windows Server 2019. There was many feedback from the market, so Microsoft decided to open Windows Server 2019 for the Microsoft 365 apps. But this means that they always have to keep about this older operating system when there are changes in the Microsoft 365 app ecosystem and development. And this means there must be somewhen the time where you decide to not longer support this modern life cycle on the long-term servicing channel platform. And this decision was made with Windows Server 2022. I think this is a good decision because we have options like the long-term servicing Office option and like the support on Windows 11 and with Azure Virtual Desktop also on premises. If you have questions about this chart, feel free to use the chat or feel free to use the Q&A hour. we have on, I think it was 12th of May, where you can also bring your questions for sure for this topic with you. Yes, 12th of May, 10:30. So at this point, thank you very much for your time, and I will show you the overview of the next tech talks at the end of this live stream. Hope to see you all in the next live stream on May 12th with the support hour, time for your questions, and on May the 16th about what is Azure Stack HCI, understanding its benefits. Looking forward to see you. Wish you a nice rest of the day, and thank you for your time. And I will stay online for a few minutes if there will be questions in the chat from your side. Thank you very much so far. See you in the next live stream. Bye.